let's talk about the best books I read in 2023. Hi, I'm Colleen Delaney. If you're new here, I talk about books and writing. Today, we're going to talk about my favorite books I read in 2023. I read across the board for genres. This is going to be a wonky list because that's how it's going to be. If you're new here and enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, comment, engage with me in some way. As always, in the description, I always put links to my newsletter and some of the books I have written because I am an author. Today, let's talk about some of the best books I read in 2023. You're going to get some weird breakdowns. You're going to get my top 9 romance books. You're going to get my top 3 thrillers and my top 8 of everything else. That's just how I broke it down. I'm sorry. It's just how it worked. I read a lot of romance. I considered making it a top 10, but then I thought, I'm just going to stick with the cream of the crop. Same with my other 3 thrillers. I mean, it is what it is. Across the board, these are my top 20 books. Let's start. Within each subcategory, you are going to get my favorite books. So I'm also going to give you my top 3 books of the year. So you're going to get my top 3 and my top 20. Let's get started with romance. First up, we've got The Song of Lorelei by Desiree Nicolai. This is book 2 in the Haven Cove series. We are following Killian, who is a seaboat captain, and Lorelei, who is a mermaid/siren. She, in the first book, found out that she was a mermaid, came to terms with what that meant for her. There is a lot going on in this book that is a little bit spoilery for the first book, so I'm just going to give you kind of like a vague description. We've got some science experiments going on mermaids/sirens. We've got some ecological horror things going on with pollution affecting how the brains work of these creatures. And we've got a lot of hot, spicy times between Lorelei and her captain, Killian, who is naked on the cover. You gotta love a naked hero on a romance novel. That's all I say. There's going to be a 3rd book in this series coming out this year. I can't remember exactly when, but I feel like it's summer or fall. So I've got a while to wait, but I can't wait. Next, I've got Mickey Chambers Shakes It Up by Cherish Reed. I love Cherish Reed. She's on a lot of these lists. This is a contemporary romance about Mickey, who is a professor, but she has no money, as a lot of professors do. And so she gets a job at a bar to bartend to make a little extra cash. And her boss, Diego, is a very grumpy man and she's a very sunshine. And it turns out that he's also taking one of her online classes. So they've got this weird teacher-student, boss-employee relationship thing going on. This book was super fun. If you want to read something that you're just going to fall into and smile the whole time, Cherish writes very funny banter, which I really enjoy, and very hot sex scenes, which are, as you're going to tell from this list, a must for me. I read it in May, I think is when it came out. And it was a perfect, warm weather, fun book to read. I really enjoyed the character of Mickey. Diego was very spicy hot. He dethroned John Donovan, who had been my favorite Cherish Reed hero before that. I mean, you should read Hearts on Hold, which has John Donovan, if you want to read about a very hot children's librarian. Also very good. So this book has a lot of fun tropes. It has fun times. It feels very sunshiny because Mickey's personality is very bright. So grab it if that sounds good to you. Next, I loved In a Jam by Kate Canterbury. I have been wanting to pick this up for a while and then finally did, and it did not disappoint at all. It's about Shay, and she starts off with her fiance ditching her at the altar, and then her step-grandmother dies and leaves her farm in rural New England, and it comes with some contingencies. The contingencies are that she has to move to this town and that she has to get married within a year. And she's like, well, my fiance just left me. I don't really have anyone to marry. But Noah, who is her very good friend from high school and has been in love with her forever, is like, well, I'll marry you. It's not a big deal. So they do a marriage of convenience. And Noah has a adopted daughter who's his niece because his sister is in jail and very troubled. And the 3 of them become sort of an instant family. Kate Canterbury writes the spiciest scenes. This is a Hallmark movie. A little darker though, because the stuff with Noah's niece is darker than a Hallmark movie. But so spicy. Don't recommend this to a family member who you don't want to know the level of spice you read. Very fun. I read this I'm going to just tell you about when I read these also. I read this outside on a beautiful weekend, I think at the beginning of June. Wonderful. My next favorite was Irish Goodbye by Katie Hunter. This is a like contemporary celebrity romance, and I read this one in the summer. It was beautiful outside. And this one, we've got such an interesting take on ghosting, which I really liked. So Cass and Ryan have been dating for a very long time, like a couple of years. Ryan is very famous though. He's in like the hottest boy band in the world. And Cass gets like a breakup text from him and then blocked completely by him on everything. So she has like no way to contact him unless she like runs into him. And also this bank account that they had, which was like he was paying for her rent, is like emptied of money. So she is understandably extremely hurt. On the other side, Ryan believes that Cass has broken up with him and blocked him on everything. And he doesn't know what happened. Okay, so that's the plot where we start. And then we see months later when they actually run into each other what happens. I really loved, because ghosting is such a weird thing and not something I've ever had to deal with because I have been with my husband since 2001 and it was a different time then. Like when I started dating my husband, I didn't have a cell phone. So life is very different now, but I really liked this different take on ghosting about how it could actually work, how a way that a person in a contemporary novel could like disappear and it would make sense. And it does. And it was very fun. One of my other favorites was An English Bride in Scotland by Lindsay Sands. This is the first book in the Highland Bride series, and it was crazy. And it had like a big resurgence over the summer on Twitter where everyone was like binge reading it. Now, I didn't do that. Now, at this point in January of 2024, I've read 4 of them. I read books 1, 2, and 3, and then I think I read book 7 or something because I just decided from then on I'm not going to read them in order. Just I like getting the paperback, so whenever I see one at like Barnes & Noble, I think is where I've gotten all of them, I'm just going to grab it. So in this one, you get introduced to this bonkers world that takes place in medieval Scotland. So you have Annabelle, who is supposed to be a nun, and then her parents, who she hasn't seen in years, just show up and are like, hey, you actually have to marry a guy. She's like, I was supposed to take holy orders. She hasn't yet though. And they take her home and marry her off to this guy. Ross is none the wiser. He thinks this was probably the woman he was supposed to marry all along, but then finds out that he was supposed to marry her sister. And it's like, what's going on? Because Annabelle doesn't actually know how to like live in a medieval household. And she's the woman he was supposed to marry is supposed to be like training to run a household, which is apparently, you know, a lot of work. I don't know a lot about running a medieval household. I know nothing about it. But then you'd think this would just be like a normal medieval romance where she figures out how to run a household and they fall in love. No. Everyone is trying to murder them and they continually get head injuries that you should have an MRI for. And it is so much fun. And that is what this series is. This series is people in medieval Scotland surviving injuries they have no business to, while also having a lot of fun, sexy times. You're welcome. Next for you, I have Striking Gold by Janine Amesta, and it is about Mia and Ross, who were very good friends in high school. 10-ish years have passed. Mia has had this sort of like failed political career and is moving back home with her dad, and she's trying to find a job, and she walks into a jewelry shop, and she wants to work there. There's help wanted, and the owner recognizes her, and she has no idea who he is. And then far too late, she realizes this is Ross, who she was very good friends with in high school, and then he kind of disappeared, and she's really messed up. What I really loved is the whole time they're like having this conversation, Mia's like, this guy is hot, and why don't I recognize him? And you know, it's been a long time, and I'm not gonna lie, I have this weird thing where I went to high school with my husband, but we didn't start dating until the summer after senior year. So we have very different groups of friends. So we will see some people because we live not like close, but like relatively close to where we went to high school. We'll see people, and my husband will be like, that's Jack whoever, and I have no idea who that person is. So I felt for her in this because that happens to me all the time, and vice versa with him. Like I'll recognize people. We went to a very big high school. I'll recognize people and he'll have no idea who they are. But obviously this is going to go from Ross being pissed at her to them dating. And one of my favorite things about this book is the jewelry description. Ross is a jewelry maker, and I never thought that was like a thing for me. I'm not a big jewelry wearer. I have no jewelry on. I wear a plain wedding band. But I loved reading that description. It was so fun. It was like on tier with food description. A blast. It's the first in a series. I've read books 1 and 2. I have 3 waiting for me on my Kindle right now, and I can't wait to start it. My next great read of 2023 was one I read very recently in December, and it's This God of Mine by Sophie Jordan. This is book 4 in the Rogue Files series, and it was a delight. It is about Clara, who had a horrible fiance, and she could not get out of this engagement, and she was very worried about her safety going to this marriage. So she decided to just ruin herself, and she told her fiance she was pregnant with another man's child and she would just make a cuckold of him. And he announced it to the world, but she did get out of the engagement. She moves to Scotland to live with her brother, who's a duke, and her brother is like, kind of like, okay, like, what happened? You're pregnant and you won't tell us who the father is, because that's the other thing. She won't tell anyone who the father is because there's no baby. And her brother's like, okay, I guess you'll just like live here with us. Like, you're welcome, but like, okay. Her brother's book is book 3, which I really enjoyed also, and might have been on my best books of 2022. I cannot remember. But once she gets to Scotland, she meets Hunt, who is a Scottish laird, and they have like a weird meet cute in the middle of a tavern brawl. And she thinks he's attractive and he thinks she's attractive. And then he finds out that she is pregnant with another man's child, and her brother's like, will you marry my sister? And he's like, perfect. Because Hunt has a curse over his family that the men in his line always die before their child breathes their first breath. So like his dad died before he was born, his grandfather died before his father was born, and so on and so forth. And he's like, this is great. I can have the experience of being a father to this child, because that's something he's really like mourned, that he's never gonna have a family, without dying, because it's not my child. I can just marry this woman and have this child. And also she's like really attractive and we can have sex for like 8 months. He doesn't tell her any of this, of course. And she knows about the curse, but she's like, it's stupid. And so she does marry this man. And you can guess what happens. And I loved the ending, and I loved how they handled the curse, because it was great. It was wonderful. I love Sophie Jordan. Her world is just such a fun world to fall into. Okay, for the next one, I am just grabbing my computer because I don't want to forget anybody, and it is a compendium, a collection of books called Even If the Sky is Falling. And I want to make sure I don't forget any of the authors, so I'm just going to tell you the titles, or no, not the titles, but the authors that are in here. So it's by Taj McCoy, Farrah Heron, Lane Clark, Cherish Reed, Sarah Smith, and Denise Williams. Now I'm going to set my computer down. The concept of this is that there's been like asteroid pieces falling to Earth, and the United States now has this alarm system that if there's going to be like a big piece or even a small piece, that this alarm system will go off and you can take shelter for however many hours. I think it's 24 hours you're supposed to be sheltered. Now, our first book is about some soldiers on a base and someone accidentally sets it off. And then each story is about different people who are kind of trapped in a forced proximity situation with someone during this 24-hour fallout. My favorite thing about this book is every single author gave the people a bathroom, because I would be in a full-on panic if I had to pee in front of someone I was attracted to. 100%. I say this as a 40-year-old who's been married for I don't know how long. We've been together for 22 years. I always forget how long we've been married. I think 12 or 13, around there, a while. So it was so fun. My favorite standouts was, of course, Cherish Reed has a book in here, has a short story in here, and I love her. And hers takes place under an indie bookstore in Chicago, and it has some like really fun communist role playing in here. That was a blast, that I was like laughing audibly when I read this outside in my backyard, and my daughter came over and was like, you're laughing so hard. What's so funny? Will you read it to me? And I was like, absolutely not. Get away from me. No, I didn't say that. I'm sweeter to my daughter. Hers was a standout. Sarah Smith's was great too, with a handyman getting trapped in the basement. Loved that one. They were all great. You should read it. So much fun. So I did save my number 1 book for last, and it was Grim and Barrett by Julia Cross. Now, this was my favorite series of the last few years. This was the last book in the series. There are going to be some spin-off things, thankfully. But this whole series has been about the Savoy sisters, who are witches living in New Orleans, and them finding their soulmates. The last one, this is Clara and Henry, and we've been watching them for a long time because he's been like a side character, and I've just been waiting for their book. And I had to wait till last, which makes sense because you do always put the one everybody wants the most last. The fun thing is Clara has some like visions and she knows she's supposed to be with Henry and she can't figure out why he's not making a move on her. And so at the beginning, it's very much like, don't you like me? You should like me. And I liked that a lot. It does have some darker themes in it. Henry is a Grimm, which is a very fun paranormal creature that Juliet Cross did make up. That's very secretive, very dark, and they have some weird powers. And Henry has some very weird powers. There's this plot line in which his father is arrested for murder and Henry does not like his dad at all, but he has to kind of go and figure out if his dad ever actually did anything. I loved this. Juliet Cross is the queen of spice. They're very spicy and very fun. I'm going to reread this series in its entirety because I loved it so much. I've decided that I need to one of these days take like 2 months and just reread all my favorite books because I want to get back in this world. I want to jump back into it and feel how it feels to live in the world of the Savoy sisters. That's the best way I can put it. Wonderful book, wonderful series. You should definitely read it. We're going to move on to thrillers. And for romance, that was a mix of new releases and older books. Most of them were new releases. This English Bride in Scotland, This God of Mine, and In a Jam didn't come out in 2023, but I think every other book I read did. I'm pretty positive. So for thrillers, I have 2 that came out in 2023 and 1 that is a backlist. And my first one that I loved is The Backlist, and that was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I was told for years to read this book because I really liked The Maidens. I read that the year it came out, and I finally saw it at my used book sale, grabbed it, and read it in like 24 hours. It is a great book with a great twist. So our narrator in this book is Theo, and he is a psychologist, and he is a little bit obsessed with this person, Alicia, and she was an artist, and she brutally murdered her husband and then never spoke again. And so Theo is trying to first get a job at the hospital, like mental hospital place that Alicia is being kept. And then he really wants to like get her to have a breakthrough and speak again. Theo becomes a little bit of like a private investigator and interviews some people in her life at the time of the murder. And I really enjoyed it. It had a very good twist. Obviously, when I started this, I was like, obviously this is gonna have a crazy twist, so I'm gonna try and figure it out. And so I like read 2 chapters and then took some time and tried to figure out the twist. And I got close, but I didn't get it completely. And I liked it a lot. I just got Alex Michaelides' new book, The Fury, from Book of the Month, like a couple days ago, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I think he writes a really good mystery. Next, I have None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I will say this book has like some very triggery stuff in it, so I would maybe read some content warnings before you read it. And a lot of like bad stuff does happen to people that are good people. So just know that going in. This starts with Alex and Josie, and they just meet each other one night at a restaurant and realize they're birthday twins. It's both of their birthdays. And Alex is a successful podcast host. And Josie is like, I think you should interview me on your podcast. And she kind of dangles this carrot in front of Alex about like her life being really crazy. And so Alex goes for it. And very quickly, Alex realizes that Josie's life is nuts and like some stuff has happened in it that is not good. And I don't want to give anything away, but None of This Is True is the most perfect title for this book because you finish this book and you're like, who in this book was telling the truth? Now, I think this is not really spoilery, but slightly. So jump ahead like 15 seconds if you don't want anything spoilery. I think you're supposed to finish this book not knowing who was telling the truth the entire time. I don't think everyone will interpret the end of the book the way I did, but that's how I interpreted it. I really liked this book a lot and made me want to read more by Lisa Jewell. And then my favorite thriller of the year was The Writing Retreat by Julie Bartz. One, because the sense of dread reading this book was uncomfortable. I was reading this book and really enjoying it, but like, you get that like, oh my God, feeling. And then my husband went out of town and I had to not read it while he was gone because I was too scared. So she did a very good job at keeping me on my toes. This is about Alex, another Alex, who wants to be a writer. And she's kind of like in the depths of despair. She never thinks she's going to be a writer. And then she gets picked by this woman, Rosa, who's like this very famous author who she loves, to come to her writing retreat. in which she invites like 5 or 6 women every year to come stay at this house in upstate New York where they get snowed in. And I don't think this retreat happens every year. I think it's like every couple years it happens. And she goes, and when she gets there, her ex-best friend Ren is there, and they had a horrible falling out. And then lots of really weird stuff starts to happen. And you don't know if Alex is having like a mental breakdown or if some really weird stuff's going on in this house, but it's very good, and it's very locked house, and very can I trust my own consciousness, because there are some drugs done, and I loved it. Great book. On to my top 8 other, which is so weird, but it's just what I've got for you. I'm also don't have these in any order. I will do my favorite one absolutely last, because I just sort of plopped these down on the floor next to me, and it'll just be easiest for me to just pick them up as we go. So we're starting with I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai. This is a lit fic with thriller vibes, but I wouldn't call it a thriller because the pacing is definitely lit fic. So Bodhi is our narrator, and we jump timelines. So the present, she's gone through a divorce. She is a podcast host, and she hosts, her podcast is about like unsolved crimes, sort of. She gets asked to come teach teach classes at her old boarding school. And she does. And she's teaching 2 classes. One is about film and one is about podcasting. In the one about podcasting, she asks every student to pick a topic related to the school they go to and come up with a podcast about it. And one of her students asks if she can please do the murder of Thalia, last name I can't remember, let's see, Keith, and the arrest of Omar Evans, which is something that happened when Bodhi was at school. Thalia had been her roommate, but not the year she was murdered. And she was murdered, and a janitor at the school, who was a young Black man, was arrested and convicted for her murder. And this student wants to just kind of investigate the murder. And now we go back through Bodhi's memories, through other people's memories, to figure out if the right person is in jail or if something else happened. And you kind of get to see like how the investigation was really messed up. I loved this book. You're also going to notice that almost all of these books are from Book of the Month, and that is, you know, a great advertisement for this service. My next book that I absolutely love is Banyan Moon by Tao Tai, which I totally bought on a fluke because I knew someone named Tao Tai like 20 years ago, and I thought it might be her. She was very good friends with my husband. I don't know her very well, and it wasn't her, but I'm so glad that I bought this book because of that. This is a generational story about 3 women who live in Vietnam and Florida and like a little bit of Michigan in the United States. It's a grandma, a mom, and a daughter. And you follow all 3 of their stories. So this is kind of a hard book to classify. It was nominated for Goodreads Award under historical, which kind of works because part of the story takes place in like the late 60s and 70s. And part of it takes place in the 90s, but also a lot of it takes place now. So I didn't really feel comfortable with it could be called historical fiction or contemporary fiction. I think you just put this in lit fic because it kind of doesn't fit in either of those. The grandma is Min, and she escaped Vietnam during the war and came to Florida. And I'm not gonna remember how to pronounce the mom's name, and I totally forgot to look it up, and I'm so sorry. It's H-U with an accent, O with an accent, and G, Hong. And she talks about, her parts are about her living in Florida with her ex-husband, who, well, he's like her ex, he ran away, and a young daughter. And then lastly, we have Anne, who is accidentally pregnant by a guy she's not really sure if she should stay with. And it was just a really good generational story about the relationships between these women. And it's called Banyan Moon because there's this house in Florida that the grandma and mom have lived in, and Anne comes home to, and it's got this huge banyan tree and like the emotions connected with this house. It was a really beautiful generational story. If you like generational stories, definitely read this one. I really enjoyed it. And I love how she ended it because I don't want to spoil anything, but not every plot line's happy. And I like when books like this end like that. Don't you dare do that in a romance, but in this kind of story, I like it. Next, we've got The Invisible Hour by Alice Hoffman. I read 3 or 4 books by Alice Hoffman this year. I can't remember. I think 3. This was by far the best. She's obviously one of my favorite authors. And this book is kind of a weird one to describe. So we start the book with Ivy, and she is pregnant out of wedlock, runs away from her parents, and ends up kind of getting taken in by a cult. Then we follow her daughter, Mia, who escapes the cult. And then the book goes kind of crazy because Nathaniel Hawthorne becomes the main character and it becomes a fantasy novel. Alice Hoffman is the queen of making you fall in love with a character in the shortest amount of time possible. We're with Ivy, Mia's mom, for like 30 pages maybe. And you just feel her in every inch of your soul when you're reading her story. And then you fall in love with Mia. And then you fall in love with Nathaniel Hawthorne. A big part of the book is how the book The Scarlet Letter changed Mia's life. And here's the deal. I hated that book when I read it in high school. I read it when I was 15 in my American Lit class, who I had a phenomenal teacher for. But I did not like that book at all. I liked Nathaniel Hawthorne as like an early American figure. I went and saw The House of Seven Gables when I was in Salem. And I took a class on him and his friends, the Concord Writers. And I do think he's very fascinating, and like the love letters he would write about his wife were amazing. I read this book and thought I should reread The Scarlet Letter. That's how good this book is. So if you like fantasy / magical realism / Alice Hoffman / character development, just read this book. It was wonderful. Next, we have Wayward by Amelia Hart. I saw this cover and knew I was gonna fall in love with this book because this came out in like March. And if that cover doesn't scream spring to you, I don't know what does. And B, it's got a blackbird, it has tons of insects and fruit, and it's a magical realism book, which was obviously very much my jam this year. This is a weird book to classify because I think Book of the Month classified it as magical realism. Goodreads classified it as historical fiction. It's both of those, but also contemporary fiction. We're on 3 timelines, and I'm just gonna open this up so I can remember everybody's name and year. 2019, we're with Kate. She is running away from an abusive husband and is pregnant. 1619, we have Altha. She is awaiting a witch trial. And then 1942, we have Violet, who is living in a like crumbling estate during World War II, but she's like a teen. And all 3 of these women are related. They're from the same bloodline, and they have weird powers that have to do with birds and bugs, which I loved. The best part of this book was every single plot line was equally interesting the entire time. And I'm currently reading a book that has 3 different narrators we've followed, and I don't feel that way. And I think that makes a book so good, is when you're on the edge of your seat following whoever, Altha, Violet, or Kate, and the chapter ends and you switch to another one and you're not like, dang it, I want to stay with that person, because you're thinking, oh my gosh, remember where we left them. Amelia Hart did such a good job keeping everybody at the same level of action and interest. Content warnings. There is on-page sexual assault. There's on-page domestic violence. Keep that in mind. There's also on-page abortion that's not like safe abortion. So there are a lot of content warnings, but I really like this book. If you feel like you can handle that kind of stuff, definitely read it. Up next, we have a book that I literally just read in December and am still thinking about, and it's The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This is a historical fiction, but it's also like a little bit of a mystery. We're following Martha Ballard, who is a real person. And it's so weird. After I read this book, I was listening to a podcast that like tangentially mentioned her. And I was like, that when that stuff happens, it just feels weird in your life, you know. It's Maine, it's 1789, but it's also like, we also go back in time to like 30-ish years ago and like 40-ish years ago and like 20-ish years ago. You jump around a bit. The majority of the book takes place in 1789 in Maine. So the Revolutionary War is over and we are in early America with Martha Ballard, who is a midwife and also kind of doubles as like a sort of early coroner. The book opens with a man being dragged out of the river and she's asked to examine the body. She thinks he was murdered. He was also accused of rape recently. And then a judge insists that this other doctor look at him and say it was an accident. And now Martha is trying to figure out why this judge, who was also accused of rape, is covering up this death. I loved this book. Content warning. All of this book has to do with sexual assault. All of it. Okay, so like in the present, we've got this two people that were accused of rape. In the past, we have some people accused of rape and some actual on-page rape, which is very brief, but just so you know, it is in there. I know that will maybe get people not to read it, but I also have to tell you that the love story in here between Martha and her husband, who have been married for like over 30 years, and they have 6 living children, is so good. She wrote it so well. Like, you so believe that these two people were like deeply in love, which I really enjoyed, because I do feel like when you read a lot of historical fiction that is not historical romance, you don't get a lot of like love relationships that seem realistic, that these people are just in love and they are still in love and they had a bunch of kids together and they're still in love, even though they're in their mid-50s. I loved that. Another content warning I just remembered is she is a midwife, so there's a ton of childbirth in here. So if you don't like reading childbirth, also maybe don't read this book. But it's such a good book. It's such a good book, but it just does have some content in it that isn't for everybody, but I loved it and I'm still thinking about it nonstop. Switching gears completely, I've got The 5-Star Weekend by Ellen Hildebrand, which does not have any content warning, stuff like that. This is a love letter to Nantucket, as most of her books are. This has all the food description and setting description you could want about Nantucket. It's wonderful. It's about a woman who is recently widowed and she decides to have a 5-star weekend, which is when you invite your best friend from each stage of your life to come have like an amazing trip, but you take care of everything, you pay for everything. So she has her best friend from high school, her best friend from college, her best friend from when she was a like young mom, and then a new best friend she's made recently, and then her daughter comes. She's technically the 5th star, but her daughter comes to document the entire thing. I loved it. Ellen Hildebrand is such a fun beach read, but like, I don't want to dismiss her book by calling it a beach read, because I feel like that has like a negative connotation. It doesn't. It's great. Her setting description is as good as someone who creates a world in a fantasy realm. That fantasy realm is Nantucket, and I want to be obscenely wealthy and live on Nantucket. Don't we all? Next to recommend to you that I loved was Mame by Jessica George. I'm pretty sure I read this last January or maybe the beginning of February, and I'm still thinking about it. Jessica George did an amazing job with this book. The premise is we've got Maddie, and she's the child of Ghanaian immigrants living in London, and she feels very much like not 100% British, but like when she visits Ghana, she doesn't really feel like she fits in there either. So you've got a little bit of that feeling of like, I don't know where I belong. She's also in her 20s, so she's going through a bit of a quarter life crisis. She's just gotten a new job and she's, kind of got a lot going on. She has been a caretaker for her father, who has Parkinson's, for years, and her mother has just moved back to London and has been like, get out there, go be a young 20-something and enjoy yourself. And she does. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler content warning right now. So jump ahead 10 seconds if you don't want to. This does include parental death, and the middle of the book is very sad. Okay, spoiler over. I thought that Jessica George did such a good job at capturing what it feels like to be in your 20s and not really know what you're doing with your life, and not really know who your best friends are and who like lifelong friends are going to be, and just figuring out stuff about your family and stuff about yourself and what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And I really, really enjoyed this book. My number one book of 2024 was not released in 2024, but it has to be my number one book. I'm looking up right now when it was released. It was released in 2020, and I think everybody should read it. And I did give it to one of my aunts for Christmas this year, and she texted me on the 27th and said she read it in one day. Thank you so much. And it's Migrations by Charlotte McConaghy. I love Charlotte McConaghy. I hope she has another book coming out soon. She's only written 2 and I could use like 30. This book, though, I'm going to tell you, has very much a theme of hopelessness. And I did cry so hard when I was reading it that my child, who was 9 at the time, is 10 now, came up to me and said, Mom, I think you should stop reading that really sad book. We're in the near future. It doesn't feel so far removed that it's like even like 50 years from now. We're in a near future, and the world is going through a mass extinction of animal life. So the world has kind of become uninhabitable for a lot of animals, and like the seas have been overfished, and it's to the point where like you don't see animals outside. And the top scientists of the world are trying to figure out what animals they need to save so humans don't go extinct. So it's a lot of talk about like birds and bugs not going extinct because of them being pollinators. Our narrator is Franny, And not unlike Once There Were Wolves, which is also one of my most favorite books of all times, which is written by Charlotte McConaughey. And this is also now one of my most favorite books of all time. Franny is an ornithologist, and she has kind of like snuck onto a boat that's going from the Arctic to the Antarctic because she wants to follow what's probably the last migration of the Arctic terns, which are birds that fly from one pole to the other. And you can tell that some horrible stuff has happened in her life. And it gets revealed to you slowly. And as it gets revealed, it gets very heartbreaking and it's very sad, but it's so beautiful. And I do think that everyone should read books like this, books that break your heart and books that make you think about animal extinction, which I know we talk a lot about global warming, but we don't talk a lot about like what that will actually look like and what might actually happen. And I loved this book. Read it. Charlotte McConaughey is a beautiful, beautiful writer. So those are my top 20 books of the year. And just in recap, in case you've forgotten, because I know at this point I've been babbling a lot, this video is probably extremely long. My number one romance of the year was Grim and Barrett by Julia Cross. My number one thriller of the year was The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. And my number one other book of the year was Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. Every book I talked about today was wonderful. Thank you so much for watching this entire video. I know it was very long. I hope you liked it. I hope you have a long list of books you're excited to read. You can tell me in the comments if one of these books sounds amazing. You can tell me in the comments if you read a book on this list that you agree with me was amazing. You can tell me if you hated it. I don't care, either way. Or you can tell me in the comments what your top reads of 2023 were, because I'm sure they were wonderful. If you've made it this far and you do not want to write words, which I understand, but you want to let me know that you made it this far, big stack of books emoji to represent all of these big stack of books that are now all over my living room floor and I have to clean up. As always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.